Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's great that you find time to learn something new with us. It's our second webinar about DDD. Hopefully you have time to watch the first one, but I think it's not a big problem. Today we will dive deeper into the topic. It will be more complex stuff, but I will share more knowledge about it. You are muted. It's on purpose. Please write your questions on the Slack, on the chat panel. I will aggregate them, and then there will be time to answer those questions. Maybe there will be also time to unmute it and talk. Okay. More people. Okay. So agenda is really simple. First will be, of course, Paweł's presentation. Then there will be questions and answers. And after that, there will be a quick survey. It will be a really short one. We really care about your opinion. It's our second webinar, so we would like to improve. Additionally, there will be, I will say more there about our future plans, and I will share a bit of information about the company itself. Okay, our today's speaker, Paweł Strzałkowski, is a senior software developer in Visuality and software consultant. Paweł will say more about him. I will pass the mic to you, Paweł. Good luck.
Hello, my name is Paweł. I'm working at Visuality as a software consultant, as Mariusz has mentioned, a team leader, but still an active Ruby on Rails and Ruby developer. I've been programming for the last 25 years or so, and I've always called myself a full stack developer, so I really don't fear anything from DevOps to JavaScript and beyond. I'm also a domain-driven design enthusiast, which you will clearly see today. But first of all, let's start with a story. Meet Masutatsu Ōyama. Born in Korea, 1923. Moved to Japan around the age of 15. Both in Korea and in Japan, he trained judo, box, karate, under supervision of various masters. At the age of 20 or so, he already had 4th degree black belt, so-called 4th Dan. However, the defeat of Japan in World War II marked a significant turning point in Ōyama's journey as a warrior. To recover mentally after that, he has spent over a year training alone in the mountains, mastering what he had been taught in the past. When he came back, he has immediately won the first national karate championships. So he already was a complete warrior by that time. Then another turn came in the form of a half-a-year sentence and prison time. Once again, after that, he has recovered in the mountains. He trained for like a year and a half, 12 hours a day. And this time, he was inventing his own martial art and was finding his own path. When he came back, he started popularizing his ideas. He performed countless fights. One of the hardest tests in karate world is a fight with 100 opponents, one by one, so-called 100-man kumite. Up until today, only around 20 people have completed it. He has done it 3 times, day after day, adding up to 300 fights. He has fought over 50 bulls on arenas with his bare hands. In the years to come, he became a teacher. He started his own dojo, which originated one of the most full contact style of karate, Kyokushin. In 1993, he was honored by the government of Japan with the highest degree in karate, 10th Dan. He died a year after, but will be forever known as the last samurai. Why I'm telling you this? I see a striking resemblance between Ōyama's life and the journey of someone who wants to, between his life and between someone who wants to implement DDD in Ruby on Rails. On one hand, DDD is a well-known set of patterns, just as karate was well-known when Ōyama was a little kid. However, to use DDD with Ruby on Rails means to figure out how to do it, just as he has revolutionized karate. As Ōyama has done, we need to learn the basic from the masters and then spend much time studying the art to apply this gathered knowledge in the new environment. Today, I'm going to tell you where my path has led me. In karate, there is a well-defined path of progress. It's expressed in the ranks that you gain on the way. It starts with a white belt when you go to the first training and ends at the black belt. I can also imagine a similar set of steps in our DDD path as a warrior, as a DDD warrior. First, you are interested in it. You somehow are exposed to the initial knowledge. Then you use the first techniques and write your first projects, hopefully under some supervision of your masters. Then there is this great moment where you are capable enough that you can teach newcomers. You are not really a master yet, but you have all this knowledge and all this joy and all this will to share, so you are able to teach newcomers. As the time goes on and you practice the art, you get experience, and finally, you are well-versed in all the aspects of tactical and strategic DDD. However, in karate, there are additional 10 levels of mastery. It takes a lifetime to earn them. Similarly, in DDD, with Ruby on Rails or without, you can always grow and learn new things. The way I see it, this path never ends. But before we go much further, we first have to start. How to do that? Well, first of all, it's awesome that you are here. It's awesome that you found time to meet us to hear this story. If we were comparing that to karate, you have your white belt already. Then, well, once you've been exposed to some DDD knowledge, perhaps in the form of our webinar part 1, I advise you to do the same thing I advised the first time. Start by using tactical elements of DDD in your projects. You can use them to enhance your work while still writing in the Rails way. One note about this slide, capital letters. They are used similarly to how Eric Evans uses them in the Blue Book. They indicate terms which are either coined for DDD or have been adapted by DDD with a specific meaning. So once again, if you want to start, you can still continue. You can work on your everyday project in Rails, but you can start using entities, value objects, aggregates to model your domain. As you might know, and if you don't, I advise you to watch the first part of this webinar. You can model your domain as DDD advises using those elements of tactical DDD in Ruby on Rails. But with that, we've practically done what we could have following the Rails way. Now it's time to continue. How? We could start in the very place that we left in our first meeting. When I was ending the presentation the first time, I've said we are not done. We've done a lot, but we haven't split the bounded context. We still have this one big ball of everything in one place. So to continue our path, we need to learn how to separate bounded context in Ruby on Rails. Before we split them, we first have to really understand what the business domain of our project is, and we have to identify subdomains. So subdomains, to recall, subdomains are problem spaces that we have to solve in our application or applications. Once we identify the business domain and identify subdomains, we have to learn how to map bounded context on top of them. How to do that? There are many techniques, there are many heuristics. One of the techniques that could be used to determine what bounded context should be used is event storming, a great workshop. We hope we could talk to you about that in the future meetings. For now, I'm just marking that it exists. So let's imagine we understand our domain, we know what the subdomains are, and we know what kind of bounded context we want to apply. So the big question is, well, where to put those bounded context in Rails? Let's try to think. First of all, we can just create two separate applications. Two bounded contexts where each bounded context is maintained for, let's say, by another team. Let's say we have a product catalog and we have some other context which, let's say, processes those products in some way. I can clearly imagine two separate applications going their own ways, communicating, of course, in some way. So we have to maintain this connection, but two separate applications implement two bounded contexts extremely well. It's not a silver bullet because the simplicity of that solution comes with the difficulty and the complexity of connecting and maintaining two separate applications, two code bases, to deployment units, to CIs, to test suites, and so on. So we could try to express two bounded contexts in a single Ruby on Rails application. How to do that? I advise you to try on modules. You can see the modules is a capitalized word, because when Eric Evans talked about modules, he didn't mean actually modules as we do in Ruby. He meant a distinctive part of a code base split by something that in Ruby is in fact modules, but in Java it would be packages. In PHP, I guess that would be namespaces. And in Ruby, it's actually modules. So using the term from DDD, modules, it means actually modules in Ruby. So again, at the risk of repeating myself, we can use modules to split parts of the application, and I will show you how in a second. But once we decided, okay, we want to create separate modules for separate bounded contexts, we still have to know how to maintain them. So we can put them in separate gems. Some people do that. Some organizations do that. We can put them in separate engines. Love them or hate them, they are in the Rails environment and they are there to use. I know companies that use gem. I know companies that use engines. But that is a secondary thing. First of all, you decide you want to use modules, and then how to maintain them, again, secondary. There is also something called Trailblazer. It provides high-level abstractions for Ruby frameworks, not Rails, but Ruby frameworks in general. It may help dividing logic into separate concepts, which may act partially as bounded context. And also, if you divide your logic into modules, you may use some help enforcing boundaries between them. And that's what Packwork, it's a gem from Shopify. That's what it is for. But those are tools that can help, but you still have this decision to make. You can implement separate applications or you can use modules. And with the title of this presentation, I've promised to show you how to fit DDD concepts into a plain Ruby on Rails application. So let's just use plain modules to express bounded contexts. This is as straightforward as it gets. In Ruby on Rails, we have this magical app folder where you can put anything and it will be auto-loaded. Any folder in app by default doesn't introduce an additional namespace. So if we create our code base like this, we can use, for example, modules folder. Some would advocate that it shouldn't be called abstractly modules. It could be the modules folder could be named in the way that our application is called. So if we have Joe's Pizza, it could be Joe's Pizza. That would express the meaning of our application. However, inside we have folders. Those folders introduce namespaces to our classes. But once we split our application into such modules, you may wonder what should be inside of each of the modules. And now another decision comes. If you don't want to use tactical DDD, you can just put Rails-like structure inside of each folder. You can put models, controllers, views, and so on. The configuration is actually minimal to be able to use it. And you have very explicit distinction between your modules. However, if you want to use tactical DDD to the full extent, just bear with me and I can show you what you can do. Both the Blue Book and the Red Book urge us to distill the domain layer. It's critically important to separate the domain logic from application level elements. So application level elements are those that handle the way some, let's say in a simplistic form, the way requests come into your domain. Something from outside wants to touch your domain somehow. So it has to go through application layer that translates the outside world to your context. But you have to actually split it. And I will show you why again in a second. You also want to extract infrastructural level elements from your domain. So for example, you don't want your business logic to think, how am I going to send this email? Or how am I going to persist this aggregate? We want to split those into separate layers. Later on in the presentation, I will show you how to do that in Ruby on Rails. But for now, I'm just marking the concept of this layered architecture as something that we will come back in the future. All right, so we've split our bounded context. We have plain Ruby on Rails application, we have this app modules folder, and we can put separate context in there. But now we have to figure out how to use them. So let me show you something. To start using bounded context, I will take you through several steps. I will show you a transition from using a typical Rails service object, which we all know and love, right? I will show you the transition from a typical Ruby on Rails service object, from that to operating on domain object expressed with plain old Ruby objects, so with PORO. But bear with me. In a typical Ruby on Rails application, a service object is defined in app services. And it acts as a procedural process manager, juggling active record objects, calling APIs, scheduling emails, you name it. For our use, I will show you a rent car service. It's defined at the framework level, so in app services. And the domain objects, this is something new. The domain objects are defined within bounded contexts, within modules, but they are still defined as active record object. Nothing has changed. We have just moved our models, as we know them from Ruby on Rails, to contexts to express the domain. All the snippets that you will see today come from a car rental application. So they will all be related to that business domain. Let's see how it looks in the code. Let's start with a totally simple usage of a service object. It has nothing to do with DDD. It's as simple as it gets. It just used exceptions for messaging. That's really not important. So just describe the context. So we have a controller and it uses a service that sits in app services. That service is, again, still defined in app services, but now we have bounded contexts defined in modules. So now we can orchestrate the context, perform a process using the domain layers objects expressed in active record. So almost nothing has changed. We just moved our domain from this big ball of domain objects in models to separate contexts. Yet it's extremely hard to perform tactical DDD like that. Active record serves as two layers, domain and infrastructure. It would be much better to be able to separate business roles from persistence, and we'll do that next. A very, very, very important note. Please wait until the end before jumping to conclusions, any conclusions. Screens like this show code which I absolutely do not recommend. For example, there are at least two major flaws according to the principles in this screen. So you should not save more than one aggregate in one transaction, and by all means, you should not merge two domains in one transaction. Again, just a transition from a normal everyday use service object into something more special. Let's move on. So now I've showed you that, okay, as a very first step, you can take an application app services service object, and you can use it as a process manager to orchestrate contexts. What next? As I mentioned before, the goal is to express the domain using plain old Ruby objects. So basically pure Ruby objects. All your aggregates, entities, value objects, they should be defined in pure Ruby and should be modeled accordingly. An aggregate root in our domain layer could be defined, for example, like this, as a pure Ruby object. It has all the needed associations, behavior. It's just not an active record object. It expresses pure domain logic. The question is how to use such objects without embedded persistence. Well, DDD says every persistent aggregate type will have a repository. So repository is an object which has the responsibility of persisting and loading aggregates. Let's see how we can fit one in Ruby on Rails. Here we have an example of a repository object. It's used to split the domain and infrastructure layer. Its responsibility is very simple. Its responsibility is to take an, for example, of this method. We want to load an aggregate in a simple situation. So we want to just extract. We want to load an entity from our persistence store. So we take a responsibility object. We give it an ID and say find. This repository is supposed to give us a domain object, so a pure Ruby object. But within in internals, it has to use some kind of mechanism that allows it to communicate with persistence. So if, for example, with database. And for that communication, active record is as good as it gets. So for example, in here, I want to have a repository for car aggregate. So I have a car repository to load car aggregates. But within the infrastructure layer, I have what's in here a DB car class, which is actually an active record object because I need some method for persistence. But this is like the entire complexity of this method. I give it an ID. I use active record object hidden within this repository to fetch data for my aggregate, and I initialize a domain object. So I use the repository. Now I have a pure domain object. Apart from fetching aggregates from repository, from persistent story, repository is also responsible for persisting domain object. How it works? Well, we just give it a domain object. So a car in here is a domain layer object, pure Ruby object. And the repository has to check whether it already exists. If it doesn't, well, it creates a new one, initializes a new one. If it exists, it updates its attributes, and it's done. A repository is something that allows us to extract the domain layer and separate it from persistent. Repositories have a third responsibility, which is something that you can relate to well-known query object pattern in Ruby on Rails. So a repository can also fetch collections of aggregates. But I'm not showing this method because it's actually find on steroids. So it's just find with some additional logic. All right. So now we have our bounded context with layered architecture. We have aggregates and entities and value objects expressed in Ruby, not in Rails, but in Ruby. We have repositories that allow us to connect our domain layer objects with persistence. So actually, we arrived at this. We have our framework level service, and we have our contexts. And in each of the contexts, we have our domain layer expressed and our infrastructure layer expressed. One very important disclaimer, a repository should in fact be a domain layer object, because a repository is a domain layer object again. However, the repository's implementation is an infrastructure layer object. How to achieve that? How to model repositories in domain and leave their implementation in infrastructure? Well, that's a bit beyond of the scope of this presentation. I can give you some hints later. I have a published code where you can see how to do that. But for this presentation, as a repository, I will consider the implementation of repository. And I will be calling in implementations of repositories a repository. However, if you read into a blue or a red book, you will see that a repository is a domain object and only its implementation is infrastructure. But we'll get there if we ever have a webinar on repositories. All right, having a repository, we can achieve something like this. This slide doesn't really differ from the one from the very beginning. We still have a app service object, and we still fetch aggregates. We apply some business logic on them, and we persist them. However, there's a major difference between that one and this one. Now we use repositories to fetch data, to fetch aggregates, sorry. And the aggregates expressed in the availability item and rentals client, those are pure Ruby objects. So we just distilled our domain. Our domain is not polluted by active record anymore. And later on, we save them using repositories again. There are many benefits of this. Again, I would love to take you on a journey through repositories in the nearest future. But let's continue. There is a problem with splitting the bounded context. And the problem is that the users of your website don't really care about that. They need to get data from all the contexts in their UI. So they don't want to have separate pages per context. They want to have everything displayed. For example, staying within our business domains of car rentals, we might want to list a rental history for a client. A client would like to know what car did they rent, when, how much did they pay, when they returned, and so on. But this data is from like 3 different contexts. So what do we do? This kind of data that I'm showing, expressed in this table, has many different names. It may be called view data, it can be called a read model, it has some other names. It just depends on what group you're in and what language do you guys use. But it's basically a projection of several sources of truth into a single table. To generate such a view, we would normally have to join data from various bounded contexts. Even in the case when your application is a monolith, it would require us to perform literal joins between several tables. We don't want to use joins or methods. We want to prepare data from several contexts for presentation purposes. Let's see how we can do that. Such a read model doesn't really belong to any of the contexts. It sits in the framework. It's, in fact, such a read model is in fact a caching mechanism for data spread through contexts. So to implement such a mechanism, such a read model sitting in the framework layer, not in the context layer, we can use good old active record. It's a great tool for storing and fetching simple data. So let's do just that. Let's create a rental model, which would express the list of rentals. And let's put data into it. You remember the rent car service? It fetches some aggregates from persistence. It applies domain logic. It saves the aggregates. And right after it does it, we in our application, we know what read models should be populated. So let's just do that. This is stuff added at the end of the service that we've seen before. Again, it's not the final form. I will show you a much cleaner final form at the very end. So what we can do that? So what we can do here, we can populate our read model for the sake of presenting it in the future for our clients. And if you wonder, the save record used on this active model, it's just my implementation. It's actually insert or update, so it uses some kinds of upsert inside, but it's just population of active record. All right, guys, I've just shown you how to express bounded context, how to express layered architecture, how to distill a domain, how to distill infrastructure, how to use read models for presentation. So in fact, you are quite ready to write your first DDD application in Ruby on Rails. It might not be the one that you put into production, but at least you can give it a try and you can see how it works in practice. But again, we are far from over. Once we get there, once we understand that Ruby on Rails is really just something that gives you an incredible level of flexibility, Ruby on Rails doesn't enforce the app controllers, app models, app services, app views, and it's not the end of Ruby on Rails. It's just the beginning coming from tutorial. I've just shown you that just as easily you can express complex domain-driven design patterns using mechanisms that are there. I haven't used a single external library. In fact, I haven't used any library at all yet. But there is still a place to grow, and there is still place to use more of domain-driven design patterns. And the next pattern, and the most important one, without which domain-driven design doesn't really feel that well, is a domain event. I won't be talking about event sourcing. I will be talking about domain-driven architecture. There is a clear distinction, and please bear that in mind. So what's a domain event? Event is a message. Event is in general is a very loaded word, but please, in this context, remember that event is a message, nothing more, nothing less. And event is a message that is broadcasting the fact that some aggregate has been changed. So let's take a look at this aggregate. It's an entity. That's enough for simplification, but that's enough. So we have some kind of aggregate, and we say, okay, do stuff. And it does this, does that, and so on. But the very end of its procedure, inside of this aggregate, it wants to broadcast to the whole world, hey, I've done it. And this is how it's done. So we have an entity, it does something, then it creates, instantiates an event, and it's going to publish it to the outside world. Let's see how this can look in the code. So an event is a domain layer object. If you read anything about DDD, you will quickly find that an event is again yet another object, and it belongs to the domain layer. And we have our domain object. So in here we have an item aggregate, and it has a functionality of making unavailable. As every aggregate, it first changes, as every behavior in an aggregate, it first checks the invariants, then applies the logic, and then, if it's supposed to, it wants to publish an event. How? I will show you in a second. But first of all, this is as simple as it gets. Normally, we would just end at self-available equals false, but then we want to publish an event. However, what does it mean to publish an event? We don't really want to let the entire application know that we've changed something, because we haven't actually. The only thing that we've done is that we've changed the in-memory object. We set one of its attributes to false, and that's all. We haven't persisted that. So we cannot publish this event to the outside world because it hasn't really happened yet. So what we do now is we just say, okay, this event, I will put it on this pile of uncommitted events, and I will come back to it later. Let's see where and when we want to publish. I just said that we don't want to publish because it's not yet persisted. It's not saved. So let's jump back into our repository. Now we are saving this item. And right after we save, we are able to broadcast those events. One note, how to make the saving and publishing event an atomic operation is really far beyond the scope of this presentation. Again, I would love to talk to you guys about that in the future. However, I just want to show you the principle that, okay, my aggregate has changed, so I'm saving that, so I'm committing the events at this very moment. How am I going to do that? Right now, I'm using a library, which is not really a library. It's a single file class that I will show you in a second. But I'm using something that I called event store. Just think of it as a general interface. You can put anything inside. I'm just, from the standpoint of this repository class, it publishes an event into an event store. All right, but that's not the end. Once we've published an event, the main benefit of that publishing is the fact that some other part of the application, let's say in the same context, may subscribe to that event. I don't know, guys, how familiar you are with the publisher subscriber pattern, but this is actually the gist of it. So a producer publishes an event and a consumer subscribes to that event. Let's put it like that. So this is a mechanism that decouples the entity on the left and the handler of this event on the right. But what's much more important than this picture is this one. The fact that it's not only a handler within the same context that can subscribe to our event, but also something from other contexts. So let's assume that we have 6 contexts in our Ruby on Rails application. With this mechanism, we can publish an event in one of the contexts, and this way, because of that, other contexts can subscribe to that event. This way, we've just created a fully decoupled way of, well, almost fully, but very decoupled way of communication between contexts. And let me show you how you can implement that in Ruby on Rails. Again, a very simple, plain Ruby on Rails. You might remember this class, usage of this class from the repository. It has a name that, well, seems fearful, but let's see what's inside. You might remember that we used infrastructure event store write call method. What does it do? The call method write takes an event and checks synchronously what other contexts, what handlers should be called with that event. It's just a list. So it's a hash map of lists. This is executed synchronously. And just one note, this event store and this mechanic, again, it sits in the framework level, not in the context level, because this is something that connects the context. One thought that I had when I've seen something like this for the very first time, my first thought was that it's extremely far-fetched. It's too simple to be used in production, and for sure it has edge cases that makes it unusable. Well, it has an edge cases, but by far it's not unusable. And in fact, if you open the Red Book by Vernon and you go into domain events, something like this, just in a different language, you will see something like this at the very beginning of the chapter about using domains events to communicate between contexts. So this is not something that I just took from the sky. This is actually an example of something that you will also find in Vernon's book. So again, this way, the very, very, very simplistic way, you can use this kind of event store mechanic to implement a publisher subscriber pattern. If you transform it, and if you actually put an actual event store, like event store DB or some other event store that implements PubSub pattern, of course, it will be much more sophisticated and most probably would be much more production ready. But this actually works. And even in this simplistic form, it allows you to create a very readable and code that actually implements decoupled modules of code. One thing that you can see here, I've promised you an implementation of a read model, like filling read model data that is much cleaner than what I had shown you before. And this is exactly this. We have an event, car was added. to the catalog. And one of the handlers, so one of the block of codes that will be performed, will be called, is a read model handler. Read model handler is something that updates all the read models related to car being added to the catalog. We no longer need that update read model in our service. We have this. If we have an event, then we can use that event to populate all the read models in our application. Okay, but let's move forward. So we have an event that has been written to event store, but in fact, it's just been used to call handlers of different contexts. Let's take a look at what a handler is. You may notice one very important thing. We are now at the application layer. Because we are in the condition of receiving a signal from outside of our bounded context and processing it, right? So this is a place which would be called by the event store that I showed you in a second ago. And this would be a request coming from outside world into our context. So the first layer that is being used is the application layer, and the applications layer responsibility and privilege is to use domain objects and infrastructure level objects. So it's again an entry point of our context. One note about this slide. If you look closely at the create unavailable method, it's in fact a factory method. Factories are also something, an element of tactical DDD, which I don't really talk about in this presentation. But even looking at this method that creates an aggregate like this from such a call, it's something that you can clearly see that it's yet another chapter from the blue or red book that you can just cross off the list as something, okay, it may be easily implemented in Ruby on Rails. So this is a handler, something that would be called by our PubSub mechanism. And as the very last slide with code at least, I would like to show you an application service. Because since we are now able to model a complex process by triggering a single domain and then perform event propagation, we can finally start using application services. Application services are, in fact, again, something from the DDD world, but they are very similar to what we've been using in Ruby on Rails directly. So we had these services expressed usually in app services folder, but now we can take one of those services and put inside of a single context. Of course, the service has to be created in a way that affects only a single context. Like here, a service takes a set of parameters and it creates it adds a car to the catalog. Why we don't need this process manager that we used to have? Because now we have events. And if we added a car to our catalog, then we have events which will propagate this process, but we are not orchestrating it anymore. We are now doing choreography. We leave the communication to PubSub mechanism and just embrace domain events. Well, the biggest question is, does it work? So let's try. This is the application that all the snippets have been taken from, with some additional changes for the sake of presentation. But let's start by registering to our site. So the last car rental you will ever need sounds scary, but let's move on. They even had some clients. Awesome. We have some cars for rent. Perfect example of a read model that joins data from from car catalog some pricing context. I don't know, I don't remember what's the name of it, but again, we are joining several contexts. We have a client dashboard. Again, in one view, we are connecting stuff from billing, from rental history, and the details of our current client. We can rent a car. I like pink, so let's rent it. Okay, have a great trip. Again, very typical Ruby on Rails application. The car is unavailable. Well, we rented. Other cars cannot be rented. Well, this is business rules of our application. In our client, okay, we see we have a current ride. We rented this one, and we have cost so far. Let's refresh. Okay, we are billed by a second. We can return this car. Again, it's not available yet. It went to yet another context. It's called maintenance context, because now we have to clear this car, check if everything's fine with it, and then it will be moved to rentals again. But now we have this rental history table, which shows a read model of all the rental history that we have. Again, just a quick example that it actually works and can look as not very pretty, but still a Ruby on Rails application. Okay, guys, we are almost done. I've showed you my ideas and my understanding of the topic of DDD plus Ruby on Rails. You may use it, or you may find your own way. But deep understanding of those matters comes with a lot of thinking and a lot of analyzing. And initially, it takes a lot of time. But I'd say that it doesn't have to be done alone. I started to wonder what would happen if Ōyama had help instead of figuring stuff out alone in the mountains. What would happen if he had help? Well, he was inventing a new martial art. But guys, there were other people who were doing exactly that thing in the same time. For example, those two, both Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. Those are two very famous inventors of martial arts. They have their own, they invented their own. And yet they were doing that in the same time that Ōyama has. So if Ōyama didn't find help, maybe he didn't want that, but maybe a Ruby community could help. And in fact, I'm still looking for an online space for discussion about it. To be honest, in Poland, we were able to create a very inclusive online space for discussion. For most of you, I cannot really invite you because it is in Polish for a very specific reason to make it more inclusive in our environment. But I'm still looking for such a community worldwide, where we could, for example, meet from time to time online and discuss it. In our community, what we do, what in fact I started doing is that I started inviting people for these meetups once a month. I just skipped 1 month lately, but again, we've done a few. So we are meeting for like 2-3 hours sometimes, and we just discuss DDD stuff. We pick a topic at prior to the meeting. We prepare ourselves more or less, and we just discuss because we find it interesting. If you guys know a community or you'd like to form a community, let's perhaps in some way, let's think together how we can do that, because I think we could figure out together how to fit DDD into Ruby on Rails. For me, it was just an example. I would love to hear your ideas. One closing thought. When I was first creating this presentation, it was a few months ago. I was going through this list, and I really tried to think about myself as one experienced in modeling, but because I work as a software consultant and architect, but I still know that there is much to learn. So I wouldn't call myself like extremely experienced in modeling. I try to be, but I'm maybe not there yet. But I definitely feel that I'm able to teach the newcomers. So that would put me in here, and that would put me in the exact spot where I'm at in Karate Kyokushin with my green belt. At the very end, I would like to leave you with several links. First, the webinar part 1. Second, recording of this webinar will be available soon. You may find this Ruby on Rails application, DDD example, which is an example very similar to the one that I've showed you today. It just doesn't have any front end. It's a pure API, or in fact, mostly domain layer application. And also I invite you to take a look into the introduction of DDD, a series of articles which is hosted on our pages. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, comment, or you would like to discuss anything, please write in the comment and I will love to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Paweł, for your presentation. It was awesome. There is no written questions for now. Oh, there is already one. But we can also, if you want, you can also raise your hand. There is a reaction tool in the Zoom, and we can unmute you. But let's try first with the questions from the chat. And there is a question. Do you always put controllers on the framework level, or sometimes you put them inside the context?
Great question, and the one that eventually will come to everyone. I would prefer to put the controllers in the context. However, again, I was trying to show you like a transition where we start at something that we already have and that we have in every Ruby on Rails application, or almost. And it's the transition into using context. So yes, the next logical step would be to try to move the controllers into context. Yet it's a quite big step that you have to be prepared for. Because there are some things like, if you have a Ruby on Rails application, more often than not, you have a device or some mechanic like that. So if you move this controller into context, maybe there are things that don't really belong there, and you would like to model it somehow to be really DDD compliant, let's say. So I have nothing against leaving those controllers for the time being in app controllers, but my ultimate goal would be to move them into context.
Thank you. Okay, there's a second question from Dimitri. You mentioned that we should not put multiple contexts into the same transaction. How do you deal with the data consistency?
Awesome question. One after another. So the boundary of data consistency is an aggregate. If you want to persist something more than an aggregate, it should not be immediately consistent, or it doesn't have to be. If you have an aggregate that you want to persist, then you have another aggregate that you want to persist, though the other ones should be eventually consistent. So in plain words, okay, so you persist an aggregate, and then you, let's say, you create like a sidekick job for the next one, and eventually it will catch up. If those two need to be consistent right away, then perhaps they should be in one aggregate. I know it's not always the case, and it's not always that pretty, but in general, you should not make two contexts consistent, immediately consistent. Two contexts should be by default eventually consistent. It's not the case in like almost any Ruby on Rails application, but if you go into bounded context, it's exactly for that. A single context is immediately consistent and separate contexts are eventually consistent. Even within one context, you might have eventual consistency. And how do you deal that? Well, first of all, you go to the business side and you ask, hey, can it be eventually consistent? And they say no. How in the world it could be? Then you actually explain to them what it really happens, what it really means, and eventually they say, of course, most of the time.
Okay, there is a third question. I'm not sure how I feel about the multiple modules layer through. I definitely see their unuselessness. Your event store reminded me of the interactors gem.
Yeah, well, if we go to interactor, there were so many attempts to describe something that has been eventually called service layer. In Ruby on Rails, like use cases, interactors, services, and like there were so many things there. And I have one project which I'm part of. When you open the app folder in your editor, in your IDE, you have to scroll the subfolders of app because there were so many ideas inside. And like through the last 5 years. Thank you for the kind words. And as for the modules, it's really important that it's not like you split the modules and you split the bounded context and say, okay, now I have to put layers inside of it. It's really an expression, the expression of separate contexts, and you can model each context however you like. You can put a Rails structure in some and a layered structure in other. And it's not like in this application that I've showed you, it's like there are like 5 or 6 contexts, but I presume that it's too many. Like I would split the context when I feel there is a need for a separate application, like in general, but I just want to model it in a single Ruby on Rails application. So it all comes to the use case. I'm just showing you that I just wanted to show you that, hey, there is such a way. Maybe it's not perfect for everyone and it might be not useful for everyone, but if you need it, if you really need to couple two bounded contexts or 2 modules of your application, hey, you can use this. And it actually works and it comes with minimal configuration or next to none.
Okay, there is the last questions. Last question: do you suggest to use the use of DDD from the onset of working on the project, even though you are not sure of the complexity, simplicity of the project yet?
This is something. Thank you very much. And I think this is a question that many people struggle with. And we've touched on that in the last webinar, like when to decide whether you should go with DDD or you should use some simplistic approach like active record, like straightforward. And back then we've said that, I've said that, okay, in Greenfield, it's not always that obvious. Sometimes you need to start from a standpoint of a legacy application to really know what's the complexity of your project. But I guess it comes with experience. And if you start by writing your application, you might not notice that complexity. But if you open let's say, interactive drawing board, like Miro, Lucid, whatever, and you start drawing your application, then you will actually see what's the complexity. We, as programmers, we run away from approaches like waterfall, where you had to sit for months and design your application in this hundreds of pages of books. And now we go into no design. But what Eric Evans has written in the Blue Book, it's not a decision between long design. Sorry, I'm quoting wrongly, but it's not like you cannot choose no design. If you choose no design, you just choose bad design. So you have to spend minimal time thinking, and then probably you will see this complexity. If it's not there, it's just not there. You can again use event storming and to check whether there are repercussions of your events, of the changes in your application. And then you can see whether there is this complexity or not. It's not really obvious when you start by, okay, let's write this first active record class and let's move on. If you think for a second, for let's say 3 days, and you draw it and you try to think, then this complexity should reveal itself.
Okay, there are more questions, and there are already people who are interested in to build a community around DDD, so it's great. Rafa asking to show one more time the last slide of the presentation, probably to get links from there. There will be a recording, so you can also see that later. Next question.
Let me just paste them into the comment section. Okay, just not break the flow.
Next question is in DDD. Looks like the choreography pattern fits very well, but it's orchestration pattern against DDD principles.
Very interesting question. I've never thought about that in these terms. There was this ongoing notion that that this quarrel between choreography or orchestration, and many people say one or the other is just good or bad, and it was like a dogma at some point that you should go choreography. But orchestration has its place. In general, when I think about orchestration, I see a procedural approach, where I'm much leaning towards myself personally. I'm leaning towards object-oriented programming, where we don't have this long procedure of things that should be done. It's just we do a thing. We don't do a list of things in one go. So that really, choreography really sits well in my mind. But of course, it comes with complexity of application. If you have 3 things to do, just orchestrate them if that's fine with your business logic. But if you have 15, then perhaps there are so many edge cases that you have to handle, or even testing this orchestration becomes a burden. I wouldn't say that DDD is against orchestration. I just would, as a very first thought in my head, I just don't see a good place for it there. Like if you have a domain procedure, like if you have something within your domain and you have something that I haven't shown in here, domain service, it's as simple as it gets. You just create a domain service inside your domain. So I just didn't want to show it. There were enough topics to cover. But if you have a procedure inside, so something you need to orchestrate within your domain, that's fine. Just do it if that's fine with your business logic. But I don't really see orchestrating between several contexts, because if you have a business procedure that spans through several contexts, it should either be eventually consistent in general, or it should be one context if not. A loaded question, and I wouldn't say there is a very clear answer, because in like almost every sentence that I've just said, I find something that I could argue about, pro or against. So those are just raw thoughts from my head. But in general, I see much more space for choreography in organizing the work of DDD applications.
Okay, the last question comes from Antonio. Rails allows you to access any classes from any other class. Do you use any mechanism to enforce that contexts does not access the initial classes of other contexts using modules as you have shown us? Really long sentence.
Again, very good question. And the one that biggest minds in our community, and not only in our community, have been thinking about. And there is one result that is known like throughout the community, and it's the packwork gem from Shopify that I mentioned in one of the first slides. So it is a mechanism to enforce boundaries. I personally don't use it because I didn't find it that useful, or it didn't align with my train of thoughts in general. It enforces some, well, it gives you a lot of abilities. First of all, when you take it and apply it on a legacy application, you are immediately shown this tangled thing that you've created with everything connected to everything. And it gives you some tools to slowly take the control over how things communicate. And it also enforces patterns, which you can bend, of course, to your needs, but from get-go, it gives you some patterns how to organize your code so that in each context or modules, in module or package, I think it's called there, but I don't remember. So each part of your application has an exposed API for others to use. But again, I don't use it. I, of course, gave it a good try. I read some articles. I've talked to a bunch of people about it who have used them. And have used that gem, but me personally, I didn't find that useful. Again, didn't really align with my my approach.
Okay, it was the last question. So we'll move to the last part of our webinar. I posted a link to the survey in the chat. One more time, I said that it's really important to us to know your opinion. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have plans to part 3 and part 4. Part 3 will be about event storming, the workshop technique which Paweł mentioned on his presentation. And the fourth will be probably, the third will be presentation done by Michał, our second senior developer. And the fourth will be Paweł's presentation, which he's working on. And next week he will be presenting on our meetup about the data consistency in legacy application with aggregate pattern. It will be fourth. Please let us know what would you like to learn on another and what is interesting for you. It's already in the survey, the question about it. And the last part is that I would like to say a few words about Visuality. It will be a short presentation, 4 minutes, around 4 minutes. Maybe you would like to work with us. So Visuality is a software house from Poland. We're working, we have an office in Warsaw, but we're also working with remotely with our engineers. We are specialists in Ruby, of course, but also we have a front-end department, which mostly programming in React.js. We have clients from around the world, from 3 continents. We have 16 years of experience, so company 16 years, and 12 we programmed in Ruby. We have 25, already 26 professionals on board. We have diverse type of services. It's not only the development, but also software consulting. We have our project management team, and we have DevOps. I really like to highlight that we are not a software house which are working only on the startups and producing products from the scratch. We have a lot of different type of projects, and some of them are legacy. Most of them are really difficult. I would like to list some of them. One of them are modular. This one we're writing from scratch, but it is existing application which we're rewriting, and we are using their DDD principles, which Paweł shows. So we have our place to learn. We have also application with event sourcing based on event type project. We are on daily basis we're contacting with event type project or creator. We have an application with microservices architecture. There are around 20 microservices written in Ruby. We are working with the client who have an application with AI, and there is really huge database, and there was problems with database, which we already solved. Despite the fact that we have hired 3 juniors engineers last year, we have still 8.5 average years of experience. So there are people which you can learn from, and we know how to program Ruby. We are company oriented on people growth, on our know-how, on communication. We attending conferences. This year you can meet us on Wrocław, on Roku. You can PREDRB and Rails World. We have our own Ruby meetups in our office. We really like to share knowledge and work with the community. Each week we have the backend meeting. We sharing our problems and solutions from those awesome projects. So we have our own startup. Poltrax is an application to tracking events. We have 3 crazy guys who are ultramarathons runners, and based on their experience, their passion, we build a successful startup. And before last year, they're only attending the events for runners, and now they are also organizers. We care about company culture, about transparency, about constant feedback. We have a group of people who share passion. For example, I'm a Magic the Gathering player. It's a strategic card game, and I have a few friends from the company. We creating beer and cider. We have our blog. Please subscribe to know about new blogs and events from us. On top of that, we train Ruby adepts. Last year, we ran Visuality Academy, and we trained multiple juniors. As I mentioned, we hired 3 of them, but we trained more. Thank you for everybody who stayed to the end. I think I remembered I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Mariusz Kozioł, CTO of Visuality. Here is my contact, and Paweł will be happy to answer any question about company, about DDD, about community around DDD, and anything. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, and be in touch. We will send you the server in the mail also, and we'll be informing about next webinar. Thanks, and see you.
Right.